How can something so simple as an album of music have changed my life? I'll tell you. Welcome, metalheads. I'm the host of Heavy Metal Philosophy and writer for Metal Digest, John Barbas. Now, I know that saying an album changed my life sounds pretty dramatic, but I believe it's true in this case because Blackwater Park by Opeth was my gateway into extreme metal. I was into metal before I heard this album, but I mean like Metallica, Megadeth, Machine Head, that sort of metal. I wasn't into extreme metal. When I heard stuff like Cannibal Corpse for the first time, I was like, I don't like that. That's a little bit too much for me. Of course, at this point in time in my life, I had only just begun to question my faith, so I was still a little bit scared of the more extreme side. I didn't want to be a blasphemer. I didn't want to go to hell, but also it was just too abrasive. I couldn't make that leap from something that's melodic and catchy like Metallica to something that's so abrasive like Cannibal Corpse or Behemoth. I needed something in between to break me in slow. Now, of course, I didn't know that at the time. I didn't make a concerted effort and say, I'm going to get into extreme metal, so let me find a gateway album and then I will ease my way into it. I'll dip my toes into the water, so to speak. No, what actually happened is I heard this album by accident. It was the early 2000s. I'm a teenager and there's not really streaming services yet. There's not really Spotify. There's not really, YouTube Music. You still have to download MP3s at this point, and people are making playlists, but you're not getting recommendations the way you do now. So we were still in that transitionary phase between physical media and streaming. And so what would happen a lot of times back then is when you're hanging out with your friends, everybody would have this big trapper keeper full of CDs, and you would look through each other's CDs to see what they had so that you could listen to music you hadn't heard before. And that's how I discovered Blackwater Park. I'm at a friend's house. I'm looking through his book of CDs, trying to find some new music to listen to. And he's got the usual suspects. He's got Metallica. He's got Nirvana. He's got Bush. He's got lots of rap. He's got System of a Down. He's got Days of the New. All this stuff that I've heard, 9 Inch Nails. I like all this stuff, but I'm looking for something new. And I see this burned CD, and in Sharpie, it's got written on there, Opeth Blackwater Park. And I thought to myself, Opeth, what is that? That's new. I haven't heard that before. It sounded awfully similar to me to Otep, and I was familiar with Otep because my brother had dated a girl who, her clothes came from Hot Topic, and she was big into Otep, and I kind of dug Otep a little bit too, but I thought, okay, Opeth, maybe that's similar to Otep. Well, no, definitely not. I popped that CD in, hit play, and I look at my buddy and I go, this is death metal. I didn't think you liked death metal. He goes, just wait. So yeah, after those first few riffs in the Leper Affinity, when it breaks into the clean section, then I looked at my friend and I said, oh shit, this is different. But it also reminded me of something that was a deep love of mine. You see, back in the 90s, one of my favorite video games of all time was the original Diablo. And I remember playing that game and being entranced by the music, particularly the Tristram theme song, the song that played when you were in the main town. When I was a little kid playing that game and hearing that music for the first time, I thought, wow, this is so evil and entrancing and atmospheric. This is one of the best songs I've ever heard in my life. And a lot of what I heard from Opeth on Blackwater Park really reminded me of that music from Diablo. I looked at my friend and indeed said those words. I said, man, this sounds like Diablo. This rules. But also at that time, like I said, I was a metalhead. Maybe I wasn't an extreme metalhead yet, but I wanted all my music to be heavy. And I looked down at acoustic guitar. I saw an acoustic guitar and I thought, country music, Eric Clapton. I like the MTV Unplugged albums, but of course those aren't heavy. Those are something different. But Opeth put me back on that acoustic guitar. Because as you know, another part of my background was I was a huge Metallica fan, and I really liked the classical sections in early Metallica, like Ride the Lightning, Master of Puppets, and Justice, particularly the finger-picking acoustic parts, kind of like Fade to Black, stuff like that. Well, Opeth did that, but at a higher level. Every song on Blackwater Park has it, but in particular, Dirge for November, I remember hearing that and going, I'm going to learn that, I'm going to pick up the acoustic, and I'm going to play that. I just could not believe what I was hearing. Somebody made the acoustic guitar sound cool to me, not like grandpa music, cool and fresh. And speaking of guitar, there was another aspect of Blackwater Park that really grabbed a hold of me. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. And that's from the EBow. I didn't know it at the time that they were using an EBow, but I just heard these long, sustained guitar notes that created this creepy atmosphere that I just absolutely loved. And I wanted to know how they did that. I couldn't Google it at the time, but I did go to Guitar World magazine's online forums and found out that there was this device called the EBow that you could just put this thing on the strings and it would make a sustained note, kind of like a violin player with their bow, but it was with the guitar, and it removed the pick attack sound, and all you got was that sustained note. And I was like, that's the coolest thing I've ever heard. I love that the guitar was being innovated on, and I was shocked that later on Opeth albums, they didn't use the EBow. I thought that would be a big part of their sound going forward. Maybe they didn't want to be known for that. They didn't want it to be a gimmick for them. I don't know. But maybe y'all should bring that EBow back because that thing sounds super cool and nobody is doing it anymore. So all that being said, those are the things that grabbed me, and that's what broke down the barriers for me for the death growl. I didn't really like the death growl before this album, and even during the first time hearing it, I didn't like the growly parts. I just loved the music parts so much that I was willing to tolerate the growl parts for the music that I love so much. But y'all know what happens when you listen to something a bunch of times. I got hooked. I didn't like drinking black coffee for the first time either, but now I won't drink it any other way. You just do it enough times, it becomes an acquired taste. And unlike a lot of other death growl bands that I'd heard prior to Opeth, I could actually understand the words that Michael was saying when he did his growl. He's got such a distinctive growl. It's so crisp and clear while also being low and heavy. So that made a huge difference. I'm listening for all this awesome guitar stuff that I'd never heard before. It sounded really innovative to me. And as a guitar nerd, I just couldn't get enough of it. And eventually, with enough exposure, I grew to want the death growl. Songs like Bleak and Blackwater Park, I realized, man, when the heavy riffs kick in and the death growl along with it, and it's done in a cohesive manner, not just forced, it really provides lift and makes those sections even heavier. And that changed the way that I listened to other heavy music, because other bands, they would hit those heavy parts and then hit me with some soft ass, weak singing, and it just didn't give it that extra oomph that the death growl does. And now I'm ruined forever. I can't listen to soft ass butt rock any longer. Stuff that I used to think was heavy just ain't gonna cut it anymore. But that's not the only way that it changed my life. It didn't just change the way I listen to heavy music. I want to ask you a question and see what you think. See if your personal experience lines up the same way as mine. How many of you grew up and you had friends and everybody you knew, regardless of what kind of music that they were into mainly, everybody you knew at least owned a copy of the Black Album? Maybe they owned a Linkin Park album, maybe they owned a Korn album or a System of a Down album, but everybody owned a copy of Metallica's Black Album for sure. And as you grew up, you started listening to other bands. You started listening to maybe Devil Driver or Slipknot or Behemoth, you name it. But they never moved past Linkin Park or Metallica. And now they listen to country or pop, or if they do want to listen to something heavy, they go back to the 90s. How many of your old friends are like that? That could have easily have been me. Because if I hadn't have got those barriers broken down, then I wouldn't have got into Behemoth. I wouldn't have got into Tribal Gaze. I wouldn't have got into Hath. There's so many great bands that I'm a huge fan of now, like Rivers of Nile. I don't think I would have got into Rivers of Nile if those barriers hadn't have been broken down. We all need that gateway to get from this level of heavy to that level of heavy. And for me, it was Opeth Blackwater Park. And that's why I don't think it's dramatic to say that this album changed my life. Because I could have easily have been that guy that's like, oh, you want to hear something heavy? And I go and grab the old Standby, Metallica's Black Album. And I put that on and go, yeah, I listen to metal. Do you really? So as y'all know, I've said on this podcast numerous times that And Justice for All is one of the most important albums in my life because that's the album that turned me into a metalhead. I thoroughly enjoyed listening to it through again for last week's episode, The Philosophy of And Justice for All. But I would say Blackwater Park is my number 2 most important album. I wouldn't have been a metalhead without And Justice for All, and I wouldn't have got into extreme metal without Blackwater Park. So those are my number 1 and my number 2 most important to my personal development, the albums that changed my life. And here is where I want to hear your extreme metal origin story. I know there's probably a band that got you into metal, but what's the next step? What's the gateway band that broke down the barriers for you and got you into extreme metal? Put it in the comments and let me know. I want to read your stories. If you're listening audio only, all of my social media links are in the description. Hit me on social media. Let me know. I want to hear these metal origin stories. And since we just mentioned the philosophy of Metallica and Justice for All last week's episode, would you like it if I did a philosophy of Opeth series? I've of course still got to finish the Metallica series. I've got to do the next episode of Gojira. It was requested that I do one on Lorna Shore. I could do that. I could also do Opeth. I always love listening to Opeth. I would be more than happy to do that. Y'all let me know in the comments, and that will dictate what happens in future episodes. In the meantime, if you love metal the way that I love metal, hit that subscribe button because that's all we do here. We also break down the best new metal albums that release every weekend on YouTube. You'll definitely enjoy that. Hit that like button if you also like Opeth, but I mean, why else would you be here and still be listening at this point? Anyway, the most important thing, read philosophy, listen to metal. I love you.